In the late summer of 1817, the frontier settlement of Red River, Tennessee, was a place defined by hard labor, isolation, and devout faith. John Bell Sr. had carved out a prosperous life there, transforming a tract of wilderness into a thriving farm. He was a pillar of the community, an elder in the local Baptist church, and a man whose integrity was unquestioned. Alongside his wife Lucy and their children, Bell represented the ideal pioneer success story. Yet, the tranquility of this deeply religious household was about to be systematically dismantled by an invisible force that would challenge the boundaries of reality and terrify the region for years to come. The nightmare began not with disembodied voices, but with the sudden appearance of impossible creatures on the Bell property. While walking through his cornfield, John Bell encountered a bizarre animal sitting between the rows. It had the body of a large dog but the head of a rabbit. Startled, Bell fired his gun at the creature, but it vanished instantly into thin air. A few days later, his son Drury spotted an enormous, unfamiliar bird of incredible size perched on a fence post. When he approached, it launched into the air without a sound, disappearing over the tree line. Soon after, the youngest daughter, Betsy, claimed to see a girl in a green dress swinging from an oak tree on the property. These fleeting, eerie apparitions were merely a prelude to a much more intimate invasion of the Bell home. As autumn arrived, the anomalies moved indoors. The family began hearing strange, scratching noises against the exterior walls of the log cabin. Within weeks, the sounds breached the interior, manifesting as the distinct sound of teeth gnawing on bedposts, heavy chains dragging across the floorboards, and invisible dogs fighting in the corners of the rooms. The family kept these terrors secret at first, terrified of being branded mad or cursed in a community where religious orthodoxy reigned supreme. However, the phenomenon quickly escalated from a sensory nuisance into an escalating physical assault, and the primary target of this violence was 12-year-old Betsy. Betsy bore the brunt of the entity's physical fury. While sleeping, her blankets would be violently stripped from her bed by unseen hands. Soon, the family was regularly awakened by Betsy's screams as she was slapped hard enough to leave handprints on her cheeks, her hair pulled so violently that she was lifted from her pillows, and her skin scratched until it bled. John Bell, desperate to protect his favorite daughter, could no longer maintain his silence. He confided in his closest friend and neighbor, James Johnston. Johnston and his wife agreed to spend the night at the Bell home to witness the disturbances themselves. That night, the Johnstons were subjected to the same terrifying treatment, their covers pulled away and their faces struck by invisible palms. Johnston, deeply shaken, advised Bell that this was no trick of the imagination or a neighborhood prank. It was a supernatural manifestation that required the collective prayers and counsel of the community. Throughout Robertson County, investigators, skeptics, and the deeply curious flocked to the Bell farm. Rather than retreating from the growing crowd, the entity seemed to thrive on the attention, and its capabilities evolved at an alarming rate. The scratching and beating transformed into low, guttural whispers, sounding like an old woman muttering just out of earshot. Over several weeks, these whispers sharpened into a distinct, highly articulate, and piercing human voice. The entity had found its speech, and it used it to terrorize, mock, and manipulate everyone who crossed the threshold of the Bell cabin. The voice was remarkable not just for its existence, but for its intelligence and terrifying omnipresence. It could speak to multiple people at once, carry on complex theological debates with local ministers, and quote entire chapters of scripture verbatim. It demonstrated an impossible, total knowledge of the community's secrets, openly revealing the private indiscretions, lies, and hypocrisies of the neighbors who came to gawk at the haunting. When asked who or what it was, the entity gave various answers, claiming at one point to be the ghost of an early settler whose bones had been disturbed, and at another to be a spirit from a distant land. However, it eventually took a particular liking to the name Kate, a moniker tied to a local eccentric woman named Kate Batts, whom the entity claimed to be mimicking. While the entity, now locally known as the Bell Witch, could be playful or informative with strangers, it harbored an intense, burning malice toward two specific members of the household, John Bell Sr. and Betsy. The spirit's hatred for the family patriarch was absolute and unyielding. It routinely filled the cabin with vitriolic tirades against John, calling him an old sorcerer and declaring a singular, horrific goal: to torment him until his dying day and ultimately take his life. The psychological warfare was accompanied by physical debilitation. John began suffering from mysterious, severe facial tics, tongue swelling that prevented him from eating, and a progressive neurological decay that left him bedridden for days at a time. Every bout of illness was met with cackling laughter and celebratory taunts from the invisible tormentor. Simultaneously, the entity focused on sabotaging Betsy's future. As Betsy grew into a young woman, she fell deeply in love with a respected local youth named Joshua Gardner. The couple wished to marry, a match highly favored by both families and the wider community. The witch, however, was vehemently opposed to the union. Whenever Joshua and Betsy were together, the spirit would materialize its voice to mock their affection, hurl vulgar insults, and explicitly command Betsy not to marry him. The psychological pressure was relentless. The entity followed them into the woods, interrupted their private walks, and screamed threats through the ceiling while they sat in the parlor. The constant, public humiliation and the dread of bringing a supernatural curse into a marriage eventually broke Betsy's spirit. In tears, she returned Joshua's ring and broke off the engagement, a tragic victory for the malevolent entity. The fame of the Robertson County haunting grew so vast that it eventually caught the attention of General Andrew Jackson, the future President of the United States. Fascinated by the tales of the speaking witch, Jackson assembled a small entourage of men and a heavy wagon, traveling from Nashville to Red River in 1819 to investigate the phenomenon himself. According to local law, as Jackson's wagon approached the Bell property, the wheels suddenly locked up on smooth, level ground. The horses strained, but the heavy carriage refused to budge. After several minutes of confusion, a sharp, metallic voice echoed from the surrounding bushes, declaring that the wagon could move on and that it would see the general that night. Instantly, the horses pulled the wagon forward with ease. Jackson's stay at the cabin was brief, marked by a night of terrifying noises and physical encounters that allegedly caused one of his hired witch killers to flee into the night. Jackson reportedly remarked later that he would rather fight the entire British army than face the Bell Witch again. By the winter of 1820, the entity's long-promised plot against John Bell reached its grim climax. On the morning of December 19, John was found in his bed in a deep, unresponsive stupor. When his son, John Jr. went to the medicine cabinet to retrieve his father's prescribed tonic, he found the familiar bottle missing. In its place was a strange, dark vial containing an unidentified smoky liquid. The family immediately questioned the heir, and the witch proudly chimed in, cackling that she had switched the medicines and given old Jack a dose that would finish him. A doctor was summoned, but before any countermeasure could be taken, John Bell Sr. passed away. At his funeral, as hundreds of mourners gathered around the gravesite, the somber silence was shattered by the invisible voice of the witch, loudly singing a mocking, cheerful drinking song that continued until the final shovelful of dirt was placed over the coffin. With John Bell dead and Betsy's engagement ruined, the entity's primary motivations seemed fulfilled. The intensity of the haunting sharply declined. In the spring of 1821, the voice returned briefly to inform the grieving Lucy Bell that it was leaving, but promised to return to the descendants of the family exactly 107 years later. True to its word, in 1928, John Bell's grandson reported a series of strange, scratching sounds and whispers within his own home, though this secondary visitation lacked the violent intensity and public spectacle of the original frontier haunting, fading away quietly after a few weeks. As decades passed, historians and folklorists sought rational explanations for the extraordinary events of Red River. The most prominent skeptical theory centers on a real-world, bitter financial dispute between John Bell and his neighbor, Kate Batts, over the purchase of an enslaved woman. Some believe the entire haunting was a meticulously orchestrated hoax designed to ruin Bell's reputation and punish him, using the eccentric neighbor as a scapegoat. Suspicion heavily fell upon Betsy Bell herself, along with her schoolteacher, Richard Powell. Powell was an educated, highly intelligent man who was openly infatuated with Betsy, despite being married at the time. Proponents of this theory suggest that Powell, a master of ventriloquism and amateur stagecraft, conspired with an emotionally distressed Betsy to create the illusion of the witch. This psychological manipulation successfully drove away her suitor, Joshua Gardner, and notably, after Powell's first wife passed away, he went on to marry Betsy. Despite these rationalist arguments, the sheer volume of first-hand, matching accounts from hundreds of literate, highly respected witnesses, including doctors, politicians, and clergy, makes the Bell Witch story uniquely difficult to dismiss as simple parlor tricks. The legend has deeply stained American pop culture, establishing the archetype of the aggressive, vocal, and highly personalized haunting. It stood as a primary inspiration for modern cinematic horror, shaping the dread found in foundational films like The Blair Witch Project and An American Haunting. Whether viewed as a masterful piece of frontier deception, a case of mass hysteria born from isolation, or a genuine encounter with a hostile preternatural force, the tragedy of the Bell family remains the gold standard of American folklore, a chilling reminder of a time when the dark woods of Tennessee seemed to talk back, and an invisible malice tore a family apart. If you like this narrative myth from American folklore, give it a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel for more. I will do my best to make more interesting stories like this. I have lots of campfire stories, especially from USA, London, and some from South Africa that I could share. Thanks for watching.